Hi, I'm Eve 6000, and this is Xtra Magazine's After the Sashay.
Hey Squirrel friends, it's extra contributor Russ Martin, and this is After The Sashay, our weekly kiki with the most recently eliminated contestant from Canada's Drag Race. Now let's get into it. She's the glue of season 2. It's Eve 6000. Eve, thank you for joining us this morning. How you doing?
Hi, thank you for having me. I am doing so great. I'm so excited to be here.
Good. So you were involved in the Drag Race fandom prior to being cast, and you are someone that I know as a real student of the show. Was actually being on Drag Race what you expected it to be?
Yes and no. Honestly, a lot of the queens who've been on Drag Race kind of exaggerate the negatives, and they'll kind of be like, oh, we were standing on the runway for 6 hours. It's like, no, you weren't, bitch. Like, literally, that takes like an hour max. Like, calm down. And also, like, they let us take off our heels. They fed us properly, So it's like there's a lot of like negative things that just were not true, at least from my experience for Canada. They treated us well.
Now, I was absolutely obsessed with your Matrix tribute on the runway. How did it feel to pay tribute to this iconic movie that was directed by 2 trans women, given that you're non-binary yourself?
Yeah, it was really important to me to do that because for me as a non-binary trans person, I know that I experienced the privilege of, being able to walk through life as a cis passing person. So to me, like, trans women are the people that I look up to the most, and the people that and trans men are the people that I really respect the most. So it's really important for me, if I'm representing the trans community, to always pay homage to those who are really like blazing the trail here,
You received a lot of critiques from the judges throughout the competition. Did you feel like they went too hard on you?
No, not at all. It wasn't that they went too hard on me. The only issue was that it was every week. And that was really hard to have to do that every single week. I did also feel like they were more willing to say negative things to me that they wouldn't say to others. Like, there's just things that other girls in the competition did, things that they wore, things that, where I was like, if I did that, they would have ate me alive, If any of my runways did not fit the theme, like some of the other girls' runways, they would have murdered me on the spot. But my runways were all tailored to the theme, bitch. They all fit the theme perfectly. So, they had to find other things to complain about. But yeah.
Just yesterday, you opened up about struggling with your mental health during filming. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to seek out therapy?
Yeah, I mean, well, I've always wanted to get therapy, but I've never been able to afford it. I've never been in the position where I could actually pay for it. But yeah, I found it really difficult dealing with watching the episodes, especially considering the relationships that I built with the other girls. And then when you build like these really great friendships with these people like Suki and Stephanie and Pathia and Cynthia and Kimura, like I was really close with all of them while I was there, and they didn't show it at all. So it was kind of hurtful to not be able to see myself having any positive interactions with anyone. Like, I felt like all they were showing was negative stuff. And I understand it's, time constraints and stuff, but it just was hurtful to me to not be able to see any positive representation for myself. And also the fan reaction was very, difficult to deal with. So I felt like I needed it, and, I felt like I was entitled to them covering it. So, and I was right.
You spoke about the other girls trying to therapize you. Did you feel like they didn't want to give airtime to your emotions?
I don't think they could prevent me from getting airtime. It was just my natural personality. I just always I say what I feel. I'm just on it. And the thing that really helps me when I'm dealing with something that's difficult for me is to vent and to express my feelings. And I think where the wires got crossed is that I'm very blunt and I can handle bluntness, So if the other girls had said, hey, Eve, you're really annoying talking about yourself all the time, just shut up for a second, I would have been like, okay, cool, I will. But because they felt like they couldn't say that to me, they had to try and find solutions to my problems. I wasn't looking for solutions. I was just looking to vent to my new friends, But yeah, I can't blame them for, how they reacted to me as well,
Not a question, just a comment. That wig was not flat.
Girl, well, I had to wear my flattest hair today just to, live up to my legacy.
You are super close with Boa. Did watching Boa on the show in season 1 help you prepare for this experience?
Yeah, I would say it showed me what not to do. No, I'm just kidding. I think Boa is like we are so similar in the way that we like our humor and the way that we interact together. Like we are really on the same wavelength a lot of the times. But the way that we project our personalities to others is completely different. Because she's so forgiving and she's so sweet, and I'm just like a little different. So, but what I did learn was that she had expressed that she wished that she had been more vocal in certain parts, and she wished that she had not like sat out of conversations because she did have things to say, but because she didn't speak up, it never like was shown. So I definitely took from that, and I was like, okay, I gotta know when I go on Drag Race, speak up and don't shy away from conversation.
A question that I'm asking each contestant every week: who is the most famous person in your DMs? And tell me a little bit about your interaction with them.
So have you heard of the band Eve 6?
Yeah, of course. Here's to the night.
Okay, yes. So Eve 6 is a band that was like very famous like in the late 90s. And they actually reached out to me. When the cast was announced, they posted, oh, there's a drag queen named Eve 6000 on Canada's Drag Race. We're rooting for her, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, that's really nice. And then like I noticed that the lead singer of the band who runs the Twitter is like very leftist, and so am I. So he followed me and I followed him back. And then one day he DM'd me and he asked me to work on a project with them. So that will be coming up very soon. So I'm really excited for everyone to see that.
You are a very political person, as you have mentioned. How does that work its way into your drag?
Yeah, well, I'm the kind of person who does believe that drag is political by nature, you know? For me, ethically, as a person, if you have a platform, I do think that you should be speaking up about political issues. You should be educating yourself, especially the girls with, a lot of resources and stuff. There's no reason why they shouldn't be educated enough to tell their audience what's going on politically. And I consider that very important. And I think that there is a real lack of leftist discourse in the media. So I think that's kind of our place to stand up and make those voices heard.
Now, I actually thought that your Bernie was pretty good, but
Thank you very much. I went a little Elvis there.
I absolutely love your Jennifer Coolidge. Could I get a little bit of your Jennifer right now?
Oh, hi. I don't really know what to say, but watch my show White Lotus on HBO. It wasn't my best.
Do you know what? I loved it anyways. Thank you so much, Eve. This was just fantastic. I appreciate all of your time today, and it was wonderful to see you showcase your talents on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for watching Xtra Magazine's After the Sashay. You can find me on Instagram at allabouteve6000 and on Twitter at alsoabouteve.